Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Coffee Talk brought to you by Active Girls Healthy Women program. My name is Carolina Kopyankina, and I'm the program coordinator. This Coffee Talk series is a part of the Active Girls Healthy Women program and our mission to empower Kentucky girls through movement, mentorship, and research. Through this Coffee Talk series, we share evidence-based strategies to advance girls and women's physical health, physical activity, and health. Each semester, we host two expert speakers on topics that align with our mission, vision, research, programming, or community partners. After their presentation, we will engage in a Q&A discussion, so we strongly encourage you to ask questions and join the conversation. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Gabrielle Brewer. Dr. Brewer is an Associate Director of the Corey Stringer Institute at the University of North Florida and a postdoctoral research associate in the E.C. Lee Lab at the University of Connecticut. A former Gopher hockey cheerleader and a competitive collegiate figure skater, Dr. Brewer researches how physically active individuals respond to exercise heat stress, recovery, and adaptation, with a special interest in women's health and nutrition, while managing funded projects focused on the improving health, safety, and performance of athletes, workers, and military personnel. Dr. Brewer, the Zoom platform is all yours.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you so much to the team for inviting me to speak. I'm excited to be here today. So first, I'll walk you through a little bit of the overview, and we'll certainly end hopefully with some time for Q&A at the end. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is the impact of heat on health, safety, performance, and really everything in between. We'll talk a little bit about thermoregulation across the lifespan with special attention to women's health. And then I'll spend the majority of this talk talking about different heat mitigation strategies that are very helpful to help you beat the heat in the summer. And then we'll, of course, end with some safety, giving you some education on signs and symptoms of exertional heat-related injuries and illnesses. Now, before I begin, I just want to start briefly by sharing a little bit about where I work and what we do. So, some of you may remember that in August of 2001, Corey Stringer unfortunately died from an exertional heat stroke. It was in August in Minnesota, and for 2 consecutive days at practice, he was visibly struggling and unfortunately suffered a fatal medical emergency, an exertional heat stroke. He died because his signs and symptoms were not noticed and he wasn't treated properly with the gold standard, which is whole body cold water immersion. And yes, this life-saving treatment really is that simple, an ice bath. Now, Dr. Doug Casa, who is a distinguished professor at the University of Connecticut, was expert witness on Corey's case. And as part of the settlement, the Corey Stringer Institute was founded at the University of Connecticut, where Dr. Casa serves as the CEO. So we provide research, education, advocacy, and consultation to maximize performance, optimize safety, and prevent sudden death in really anyone who is physically active. And UConn has been the site and is the founding site since 2010. So, actually, just having our anniversary here in April. And we recently just opened up our second satellite lab here at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. So, myself and my colleague Mike Szymanski are leading the efforts down here. So, we're very excited about this recent expansion. And at KSI, we conduct a variety of research studies on heat stress, both in the lab and in a field setting. Lab is shown here. Our labs are environmental heat chambers, and we simulate pretty much any environment that we are interested in studying. So we have hot, humid conditions, cold, windy, and our newest chamber at UConn actually has altitude capabilities as well. So I work on the research side as an exercise physiologist, but my team expands into other very impactful divisions. So our education, our advocacy, and our policy team, they're responsible for leading very large state policy level initiatives to help change and protect athletes in sport. And I'll highlight one of those initiatives later on. But to share a little bit about the research that we do before I dive into some of the topics that are relevant today, following Corey's death, our early work began in athletics, and we remain very active in this space today. We are exercise physiologists, and in collaboration with Dr. Elaine's Lee Lab, we are biochemists, and we study how to optimize performance while simultaneously enhancing safety for anyone who's physically active in extreme conditions. These are just a few highlights of my time at KSI, some studies and projects I have been involved with. providing heat acclimation training to the U.S. women's national soccer team before they went to Tokyo. My colleagues have tested the Guardian cap that the NFL uses. They were curious if the black one increases temperature more than the white one. And we also conduct sweat analysis for athletes to help guide their fluid replacement strategies before events like the Boston Marathon that just happened. We're also very active in the warfighter community. KSI's had 18 and counting Department of Defense funded projects, and we've worked with various branches. We do a variety of testing in the heat and the cold at different altitudes, and some of these projects have focused on validating wearable technology in these extreme environments. I specifically work with ROTC cadets. I provide basic sports nutrition education for them, and I track their body composition, usually pre to post semester, specifically working with cadets who are borderline failing any circumference measurements and standards that are set by the respective branch. So traditionally, I'm working with females who maybe are a little bit shorter, maybe a little more heavy set, and I work with them to get their body composition within the standards so that they're able to stay in the program. For the worker population, we do work both in the lab and on site, which I think is very unique and something I never thought I would do when I entered this field in college. So, in the occupational space, we can simulate different work environments, we test wearables, we test different cooling products. And what companies are interested in is assessing productivity and fatigue. So, for example, we can calculate how many errors you make when you're hot and dehydrated, among other fun things. Now, in the field, very unique work. Also, never thought I would be doing, but have really enjoyed. We conduct heat safety assessments. So, we revise educational training materials for employees and supervisors, and we write heat illness prevention plans for companies. Specifically, we are the heat mitigation provider for Delta Airlines and UPS. And even though our work really stemmed in athletics, we have just massively expanded into this space where people experience a lot of heat stress. So that is the purpose and really the biggest point I'm here to talk about today. And I don't think I have to convince anyone that the summertime is very hot for the majority of the United States, with certain areas of our country already experiencing record-breaking temperatures. 2003 to 2005 period includes some of the hottest years on record globally and here in the US. And specifically in the US, extreme heat is actually the leading weather-related cause of death. Even though I probably don't need to tell you that, you can likely feel it. The data is also convincing. The heat waves in the US have increased in their frequency, duration, and intensity over the past 50 to 60 years, and tracked by NOAA. Heat certainly impacts a lot of people, many more than we realize. There's approximately 2.4 billion workers exposed to excessive heat worldwide. And in the US, we are one country that has the highest proportion of injuries attributed to excessive heat. And this incident rate is not slowing down anytime soon. This is important because heat can be deadly. Exertional heat stroke is one of the leading causes of sudden death in athletes, and importantly, it is largely preventable. Surviving exertional heat stroke is 100% possible when symptoms are recognized and treated properly. And by treated properly, again, this is so simple. It is rapid cooling that's initiated within 30 minutes of collapse or temperature assessment. Delaying this can certainly be fatal, as we can see here. So, despite a very simple life-saving solution, coaches and staff often fall short from youth all the way up to the professional level, like in Corey Stringer's case. And because of this, our team, led by Dr. Stearns and Dr. Eason, they lead this initiative at KSI that's called Team Up for Sports Safety, where they go around to almost all 50 states. We're going to get there this summer to help change policy. So they host meetings to try and progress sport safety for athletes. And also at the national level, the Department of Labor has proposed a federal heat standard for the first time, which if and hopefully when this does get passed, this will be massive in terms of being able to protect our workforce from extreme heat. It's a completely separate talk. I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But when we talk about heat exposure, we're not just talking about elite athletes or only workers. We're talking about millions of girls and women who play sports during the hottest months of the year, often with very limited heat mitigation strategies in place. In high school sports, heat illness is among the top cause of sudden death, and in military populations, hundreds to thousands of heat illnesses are reported annually. And these numbers here also don't capture those of us who maybe do yard work when it's hot outside, or maybe we just really enjoy going on a nice hot summer run. Now, what we often think about heat and the worst case scenario, which is death from exertional heat stroke, data actually suggests that heat can negatively impact our health, our safety, and our performance. There are certainly acute health and safety effects of working in the heat, and these are closely related to one another. For every 1% dehydrated we are, our heart rate likely increases by about 3 to 5 beats per minute. So even something as being mildly dehydrated can significantly increase your cardiovascular strain while you're exercising in the heat. You'll also see an increase in your core temperature. And when I say core temperature, I'm talking about a value that reflects our deep internal temperature of our organs. And that's the temperature we really care about when we get to that danger zone. What we know from the lab is that when you have two trials and you're doing the exact same workout, if you are doing one of them when you're hot and dehydrated, your body is going to have to work significantly harder to perform the same. Something that's also really fascinating, new data in our area that is very concerning, is that in the occupational space, we're also starting to see some chronic health and safety effects of prolonged heat exposure. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but some effects on kidney health are starting to be noticed, which is closely tied to hot and humid environmental conditions. But the good news is things like shade, being hydrated, and resting can help mitigate some of these effects. So next, let's talk a little bit about what happens, a little thermoregulation 101 behind the scenes of when we are working out or doing anything in the heat. So why does this cause so many health problems and what's going on in the body? So throughout a bout of exercise, or maybe you're doing some yard work in the summer, you're going to have an increased demand on your cardiovascular system where your heart rate is eventually going to increase as long as your work is kept constant or also continues to increase. Your muscles are going to work to produce heat through metabolism, and sweating is going to be your primary and most effective mode of heat transfer that's really going to attempt to keep your body temperature down and keep you cool. So, simply put, when the heat gain that you've created within your body exceeds your ability for proper heat loss, your core temperature is going to increase. When core temperature remains elevated, and especially when this gets into the danger zone, our risk for organ damage and even death will continue to increase pretty rapidly when we don't take a break. So thermoregulation is certainly not static, and it's pretty clear that it does change throughout the lifespan due to differences in thermotolerance. So from a morphological perspective, children have a higher body surface area to mass ratio, and they're going to rely a little less on this evaporative cooling or sweating as a mechanism to dissipate heat. So kids are going to have a greater reliance on dry heat loss through radiation and convection. They also likely have a lower sweat rate per sweat gland, but epidemiologically, they actually don't have a higher risk of heat-related illness. And I think a large part of this is that they are very frequently under supervision when they're participating in organized sport. And also, kids are smart. I think they are pretty quick to tell you when they're hungry or thirsty. They're usually very vocal about that. And truthfully, we tend to lose that as we grow up and we're under certain circumstances. So maybe we are entering a new college team or high school team where we maybe don't want to speak up that we're hungry or thirsty, or maybe we don't feel well in fear that we'll be seen as weak. The same thing's actually very true in the occupational setting where many people get paid per piece and they have a family to feed at home. So maybe they're not going to speak up when they don't feel well, when they're lightheaded and things like that, because they have a job to do. So women, we'll talk about this on the next slide, but we certainly experience temperature fluctuations throughout our cycle. We also have some changes in water retention, and this lasts during and throughout and beyond menopause. Now, aging has probably out of all of these buckets been the most clear demonstration of experiencing alterations in thermal regulation. And this happens for a variety of factors. So as we age, specifically being an older adult, will have decreased skin blood flow, lower sweat rate, increased cardiovascular strain, and this can be accompanied by and certainly exacerbated by certain comorbidities, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And there's also been some data that suggests that as we age, we may have a blunted thirst sensation, which can certainly lead to dehydration. Some older individuals might drink less voluntarily because they don't want to go to the bathroom as often, so that's certainly going to contribute to dehydration as well. Aerobic fitness and body composition are also two massive levers in thermal regulation and our ability to tolerate the heat. Now, I don't really like a blanket statement that just because we're older, that means we are at greater risk, because there's always an exception to the rule and it always depends. So, for example, you can have someone who's older, very well trained, has a higher VO2 max and less body fat than someone who is younger, maybe not as fit and not as healthy. So that's why we usually say it depends. And training status and your heat tolerance really matter when it comes down to being thermotolerant or intolerant. Okay, now back to us, back to the women. So Gabe Giersch and Nisha Charkoudian are two very phenomenal researchers in this area of women's health in hormones and heat stress, and they've published a lot of great work in this area. So thermoregulation clearly changes for us women across the menstrual cycle, and this is largely driven by different concentrations in hormones. We know within exercise that we're probably going to come to the lab a little bit hotter. So this is our temperature in the luteal phase at rest before exercise it. And then when we leave the lab, we're still going to be at a little bit higher of a temperature, or when we get done with that exercise session, rather. So we're going to come in at a higher temperature and maybe be a little bit hotter. But very interestingly, this actually doesn't seem to affect our sweat rate, which is really important. And the basic interpretation of that is we are resilient and the body can kind of overcome this despite a little bit increase in our baseline temperature. There's also some interesting data about fluid shifts and plasma volume, which may suggest that women may need to pay a little bit more attention to hydration during the luteal phase. And there's likely no large impact on performance when we talk about phase and menstrual cycle alone, but this always could be meaningful for some people. Some people may have more drastic responses than others, and this really, again, just depends on a lot of different things. We certainly need more data that looks into different phases and across different birth controls and so forth. But again, this does not necessarily put us at a higher risk because we are still able to sweat and cool down properly. And lastly, we do know that menopause does cause changes in temperature. There's some really interesting data on hormone replacement where it's been demonstrated that estrogen may have a temperature lowering effect. So that would be having a lower temperature before we head into an exercise session, maybe even half a degree Celsius. This can also be accompanied by improving control of body fluids, which is both, those are both going to be positive when we talk about heat tolerance. But truthfully, the data does remain very scarce on exercise heat tolerance in this population, menopausal, postmenopausal, and the whole transition itself. But it is high on the list for a lot of researchers who are actively looking into this. So, from a lifespan perspective, from youth all the way through menopause, thermoregulation is dynamic and it is heavily influenced by our physiology, our hormones, our environment, but also our training status. How fit are we? How tolerant are we to the heat already? Are we training in the heat and so forth? So I'll elaborate a little bit more when I say it depends and that concept and what it really means. So we are all going to respond a little differently to heat stress due to all of these intrinsic fast factors listed here. So you and the person that maybe you're working out with or the person you're sitting right next to in an office, if you're asked to do the exact same task, it's pretty likely you're going to respond a little differently. That's just human physiology. One of you could maintain a lower heart rate for a little bit longer, whereas the other one might increase faster. And the same thing goes for our core temperature. This is because of our fitness status, maybe the medications we're on, how hydrated are we, and many other things. But these really impact the physiological response to and the management of heat stress. Now, in addition to our internal intrinsic factors, we also have extrinsic factors that impact our ability to thermoregulate and really tolerate heat stress. So, some relevant examples, of course, worst case scenario from a PPE perspective, we can think about a hazmat suit, something that's incredibly cumbersome onto the body and really inhibits our ability to sweat properly. We can also think about this in sport with equipment. There's actually some states and some policies that state that we can't use equipment for the first 2 weeks and things like that because we truly do have to adapt before we add on all of these other stressors to the body. A lot of other extrinsic factors here, like humidity, is going to hinder our sweating ability compared to being in a dry environment and so forth. So, what can we do about it? Next, we'll talk about these heat mitigation strategies. Our perspective at KSI, and I think many others would agree, is that there are really two levels to heat stress management and protection. The first is what you do to prevent an incident from occurring. This is how we can also enhance and improve our performance a little bit. So, what are we doing proactively? And then the second piece of this is what do you do when something happens? How do you respond when someone goes down? And how do we manage someone who is either experiencing heat exhaustion or exertional heat stroke? Maggie Morrissey from our team at UConn helped lead this consensus document where we did this for the occupational setting and we outlined the 8 main categories for heat stress management. And I'm going to talk about some of these in detail today. And a spoiler alert to really this whole presentation is the more strategies that we can add and combine together, the stronger the outcome and the level of protection is going to be. So we'll start here on the prevention side, and I'm going to cover fluid intake in a lot more detail shortly, but out of all of the strategies, it's probably one of the most powerful strategies that should always be top of mind. Another one is your clothing and the textiles that you wear. So, what you wear does matter. Picking things that are lightweight, that are breathable, and sweat wicking are going to help allow your sweat to evaporate and also prevent it from pooling on the skin. It may seem minimal, but we've studied this in the lab quite extensively, especially with different PPE, which companies are very interested in. And the data is very convincing. Also, having some sun protection is going to be important. So, wearing things like a hat, and then, of course, wearing sunscreen too, if you're going to be in the heat and in the sun during high periods of UV index. Another thing to mention is if you are ever going out alone, always let someone know where you're going, especially if it's hot outside, especially if it's maybe your first time going on that long run and you haven't done that before. Having either some type of tracking system where you share, or hey, I'm going to this park. The buddy system is really effective so that if you maybe aren't back for a while, someone can help get you the help that you need. Also, trying to avoid things like going to a remote area if it's maybe your first long run and things like that, where if something were to happen and you can't get help, that's when bad things go down. So the next one is ways that you can really maximize your rest period. So if this is just, a normal day and you're outside doing some yard work, definitely taking breaks and maximizing those in periods or in the shade, getting some water. It's a very effective way to cool the body down, and it's simple and what we naturally usually gravitate towards anyways. There are also some great body cooling strategies that I'll elaborate on in a little bit. But just maximizing this rest break, I think, is very underrated. And it's actually something companies like UPS and Delta are trying to really increase what they even provide to their workers. Same thing goes for sport, and you too, when you're out working on the weekends, or maybe you're out for a run or doing something outside. So, a few unique strategies that I'm going to talk about next are monitoring systems. So, I think it goes without saying, but paying attention to the weather and avoid being out during the hottest periods of the day if you can. They're intuitive, but it's always just a good reminder. And actually, in sport, military, and the occupational setting, you'll very frequently see an athletic trainer monitoring a metric called the WBGT. That's the wet bulb globe temperature. It is better than just the ambient temperature alone and better than heat index because it's also going to take into consideration the radiant heat that may be coming off of a turf or the tarmac. Think of the airport workers and things along those lines. And so there are policies in place that when that value heat hits or meets a certain threshold, they're actually going to pull workers to maybe take more breaks. Maybe they're going to do another round with water, or maybe they just simply can't work or can't practice. So environmental conditions can really drive how long we exercise or do a task for. You can also monitor yourself to see how you respond to the environment in real time. Some common metrics that we have published here in a white paper through AIHA, body temperature, heart rate, and hydration variables are very top of mind right now in the wearable technology space. I will say the validity and reliability of these devices can be somewhat questionable. Some are decent, some are okay, some are not recommended. Again, that's a whole nother talk, but I do think this is really the future of monitoring and alert systems, of being able to get an alert from your Apple Watch or maybe a different band or your Oura Ring or Whoop that you're wearing that will then prompt you to take a break because you're getting too hot. So these things do exist, and job sites and some sports teams use them because it just helps them evaluate individual strain and account for this individual variability in response to heat stress. So I'm going to go back to the body cooling really quick and touch on this because I think it's kind of an important concept to understand. My favorite way to talk about this when you're asking about body cooling strategies, should I implement something? Should our team invest in something? Is to really understand the cooling rate. How effective is this device at cooling you down? You can break these down into what is good, what is better, and what is best. Things that are good, that are helpful more on the preventative side, are going to be things like cooling towels. So they help keep you cool. They can help you wick away your sweat, all that drip sweat that you accumulate. And they also feel great. A lot of workers like to put these under their hats and under their PPE if applicable. I'm also personally a fan of these. I like running with them. And it's really nice to just have on hand if you're out doing some yard work. Next is going to be something that's a little bit better, which would be a cooling vest or even forearm immersion. That's because we're simply just covering more surface area of the body. And you'll see that that's a pretty consistent trend throughout these three categories. Something to note about fans is that when the temperature, ambient temperature, gets about 95 to 100 degrees, fans are actually not effective and they can do more harm than good. There's a few really interesting papers about that, but you'll see a lot of these strategies like vests and forearm cooling on the sidelines or in different occupational or military settings. And then, of course, our best and most effective way to cool someone down would, well, air conditioning is going to be number one. It's not feasible, certainly across all job sites and sporting events, but it's whole body cold water immersion. This is the gold standard treatment for exertional heat stroke. It's depicted here. It's really just putting someone in an ice bath, monitoring their temperature until they get down to a safe point. There are really three time points that are effective to utilize preventative body cooling. You can do this before work, you can do it during work, during breaks is a really effective thing to do that workers also enjoy, and then also after work or after a sporting event or a practice as well. The biggest take home point is just cover as much body surface of the body surface area as possible. That's just going to be the most effective. Okay, up next is going to be heat acclimatization, or a fancy word for just talking about training your body to tolerate the heat. Heat acclimatization is essentially just repeated bouts of any type of activity in an environment that's strong enough to induce adaptations that are going to help you reduce your strain and improve your thermal tolerance. Going back to the policy note that I made a little bit earlier, this is a very common policy that the team on KSI does work very hard to get into legislation. Data has shown that usually the first week of athletic practice is going to be the greatest risk period for developing an exertional heat illness. And we really have to ease into this when we are brand new to either a new sport, we haven't been exposed to this environment for a long enough time. Maybe we are transferring or moving somewhere new. Maybe we're returning from vacation. We lose these adaptations pretty quickly, and it takes about 1 to 2 weeks to build them back. So it's really impactful for these reasons that I just mentioned. And in the occupational setting, they even have kind of strict, guidelines or criteria that some companies have to follow. And this is even true with contractors as well. We can't just bring everyone on site from Minnesota down to Texas and assume that they're going to be able to do well, do their job well, be safe, and tolerate the heat. So there are a lot of different examples out there. But the reason why this works is that within about 5 to maybe 7 days and beyond, we really start to see these adaptations take place from a physiology perspective. We are able to sweat earlier and more efficiently. We're able to maintain the same heart rate at the same work rate or maintain or lower our heart rate at the same work rate. So we're able to be more efficient and less stressed from a cardiovascular perspective. And then this, of course, also influences temperature. So I won't bore you with heat acclimatization literature, but just trust me, it works and it is just like exercise. You can't expect someone, to go run the Boston Marathon this week without ever training. We have to practice and we have to get used to this stimuli over and over again, about 5 to 7 days, depending on a lot of environmental conditions, but we just have to practice at it in order to become tolerant. I'm going to spend the rest of the talk or the majority of the talk talking now about different fueling heat mitigation strategies. So these are some pretty big buckets to consider. And whenever I give this talk to different sports teams or ROTC cadets here, we're trying to figure out ways that we can maximize each bucket and always work to improve them. So knowledge is certainly power, understanding what works best for us within these categories and really paying attention to our body and how we respond. Combined, having good nutrition, hydration, sleep, recovery, and then timing of this nutrition, they are huge levers in maximizing our performance, reducing our injury, and most importantly, optimizing our safety. So I'm going to start with hydration. A few really interesting statistics. In the occupational space, about 70% of workers arrive to work already dehydrated. I would bet that the same is true about general population. This is always the part of the talk when I'm lecturing that every student grabs their water bottle and takes a drink, which is amazing. So if you're at home, you can do that right now. Next, a really interesting study from Will Adams and others at KSI found that when we are dehydrated any more than about 2%, which is actually not that much, we do experience some physical and cognitive declines in our performance. So we know if we are going to start an exercise activity, working outside, working in the heat, already dehydrated, you're actually already at a disadvantage. So our time points to intervene are, of course, before. If we can't do anything before, what can we do during? And then certainly after. And this is, of course, just one piece to the puzzle, but we always need to make sure that fluids are accessible, that we have fresh drinking water, and when we talk about these specific numbers, it does vary based on individual needs, how intense we're working, how hot is it outside, and so forth. And that's really something that we kind of excel at KSI is bringing people into the lab, testing their sweat electrolyte concentrations, and being able to provide specific recommendations. Now, if we don't have a lab accessible to us, one of the easiest things you can do is just check your pee. So very simply put, your pee should look more like lemonade than it should apple juice. I think that's one of the easiest take-home recommendations. Having light colored urine, moderate frequency, so about 5 voids or greater in about a time frame of 24 hours is a pretty good sign that we're staying hydrated. We can also look at hydration status in terms of body weight change. Of course, you have to consider how much you excrete, but simple things like just hopping on a scale before and after can help tell us, are we losing a lot or are we losing a little from sweat? And then also very simple and an innate response is if you're thirsty, drink. The next component of hydration is electrolyte solutions. Traditionally recommended in our field that anything that's going to be over an hour, and especially if it's in the heat, we need to consider adding in some electrolytes, about 6 to 7% of carbs with electrolyte solution. I think I pretty much explained all of these already, but the reason why dehydration is so important to avoid or to pay attention to our hydration status is it can take a toll on our cardiovascular system, which then will really affect our performance in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of signs and symptoms of being dehydrated, which I'm sure we are all aware of. And I really like this figure here, this table that just kind of demonstrates these time periods with some very basic and simple recommendations. Hydrate before, hydrate during, and hydrate after. If you're someone who sweats a lot, we need to consider adding a little bit more fluid and electrolytes, especially compared to someone who maybe doesn't sweat as much. Next, moving into food. So I'm just briefly going to talk about carbs and protein for a second and having a balanced diet really does win when you're preparing to beat the heat. So I'm briefly just going to walk through these, and I just want to shout out and say thanks to Dr. Abby Smith Ryan, who was my mentor when I was a master's student at UNC. I learned pretty much all of this from her, and she's a phenomenal resource in this area. So starting with carbs, carbs are going to be our primary and most important optimal fuel source, especially when we're exercising in the heat. It is hard training, it's stressful on the body, and if we are not acclimated to the environment and we're doing something new, maybe we're going on that long run for the first time, we're going to switch to tapping into using carbohydrates pretty quickly. So we need these as an energy source. We need them stocked up, and they help with a lot of things throughout the body. Being ketogenic and on that diet is certainly a different topic. It works for some people, but it's a really finessed diet that you have to be very specific about. The next macronutrient that does play a role, especially when we talk about all of the stress on our muscles and how hard they're working to produce heat and so forth, is we need protein. They're going to be, the building blocks to our muscles, and they're important for a lot of different things, and we certainly need to pay attention to them. We, of course, can't forget about fats. They're going to be our primary fuel source. It's what we're predominantly burning right now as we're sitting here. And they're also going to be essential for hormone and reproductive health, among many other things. So next, this is just kind of going to be a quick example. This is actually taken from an example that I gave to some ROTC cadets a few weeks ago before they went on a 10-mile ruck. And really the take-home point of going through some of these specific recommendations is that if you're, maybe you're training for an Ironman or a marathon or just training for life, maybe we want to get a little bit more specific about how much carbohydrate we're taking in and trying to tailor our intake to be a little bit more strategic. So first, just some very basic targets. This is, of course, going to change and increase the more intense or the longer our exercise is. So a really simple example that I would have the cadets do is take their body mass, divide it by 2.2. That gets us into kilograms, and then multiply that number by really any range that you're seeing here based on how intense or how long their exercise is. That's going to get us a number of carbs in grams. And it's a pretty good place to start when we talk about spreading that out throughout the day, which is what I'll talk about next. So recommendations, again, just kind of going off of an example here, if we have like a 75-kilogram cadet who's going to be preparing to do this ruck in the heat, an example for them could be anywhere between 450 to 750 grams of carbs throughout the day. This is also where we bring in a registered dietitian to help kind of finesse these numbers a little bit more. But it's been really helpful to give some of these kids a target because they have absolutely no clue, one, how much they're already eating, and two, how much maybe they're under eating or overeating, and it just helps give them a little bit of a zone to target within. We really encourage focusing on a normal meal and not changing everything up too much the night before we have a big event, and just making sure we're adding a little bit more carbs maybe than we normally would, because we want to really saturate our glycogen stores. That's going to be our energy that we're going to need to tap into during the exercise in the heat. Certainly avoiding things that are maybe very high fat or fiber, that could have a little GI distress, and then certainly alcohol too for those who are 21 and above. Now, this I think is kind of the fun part of trying to time our carbs, and this is an art. Certainly not recommending doing anything brand new on, race day for the first time, but loading up the night before, which just personally is my favorite thing to do. No matter if I'm training or not, I love a good bowl of pasta with some chicken. So carb loading the day before, that is very well known and established in the exercise physiology world. It's effective. Next, trying to get in some food about 3 hours before. A few examples here. And again, it's really just based on what someone can tolerate, but it does help us when we're exercising in the heat. If we can't wake up 3 hours before, maybe we can sneak in a little meal about 1 hour before, usually about 25 grams or really as much as we can handle. Also considering drinking and sipping on some electrolytes here as well. I did that myself this past weekend when I did a 10K in Orlando. I knew I was going to be sweating a lot, so I made sure to sip on a Gatorade all morning and actually throughout the run as well. During this ruck for these cadets, it was recommended that they do have something to sip on or maybe a gel. Some people have very different preferences, but there are a lot of different tools out there to get some quick, easy digestible carbs during a race. And then after, it's a great window and opportunity to, of course, refuel. Usually, you don't have to tell people to go eat a lot. Usually, they're pretty hungry, but it's just another window that we always like to mention. Next, moving into protein really quick. So, hopefully, or maybe you're aware that our government has recently revised the dietary guidelines, increasing protein from about zero point 0.8 gram per kilogram up quite a bit higher to about 1.2 to 1.6. Our recommendation, which you see across the board in the exercise physiology world, especially supported by the ISSN, one of our large organizations, is going to be upping that number pretty much as high as we can tolerate, closer to that 1.6 or maybe even higher if we have specific goals, like we're trying to put on a significant amount of lean mass, maybe we're trying to cut fat mass, things along those lines. We can really use protein strategies to help kind of optimize our body composition, and they certainly help with performance as well, especially if we're talking about lifting. Now, there are quite a few different options we have for timing. Spreading things out throughout the day is ideal. And I think one of the most unique protein windows that people talk about in my field, specifically Dr. Ormsby from Florida State, is this pre-sleep window is really effective. Can we have something before we go to bed, like a yogurt, a protein bar, things along those lines? But pretty basic recommendation of trying to get a bolus, about 15 to 30 grams, really spread throughout the day. And then after that ruck, the timing is debated, 0 to 2 hours. It's a pretty big window. It gives us some wiggle room, but trying to refuel with some protein as well. All right, wrapping up here, only a couple more slides to go. But one thing that we just always also have to mention that I think, especially in college students, is often maybe not prioritized, which is sleep. So, of course, the recommendation is getting quality sleep 2 to 3 nights even before an event is coming up. We can start to kind of build some good sleep patterns and habits, leading up to something that's really important, and then trying to get a really good night of sleep before we're going to be maybe having a really long day in the heat. We give recommendations like trying to always improve our bedtime routine, not having caffeine about 6 to 8 hours before bed, and then one that no one really listens to, which is reducing phone and light exposure about 30 to 60 hours before bed. I think wearable technology has really helped people increase their awareness, like the Oura Ring and the Whoop, to improving their sleep habits, but it's certainly an important piece of the puzzle. We also know this is true with sleep deprivation and temperature responses. It's pretty dangerous and something that we've also looked into in our lab. So wrapping up here, only a few slides left, but I do want to mention just talking about some signs and symptoms of heat-related injuries and illnesses and what can go wrong and what can you maybe do about it. So again, we have two levels of heat stress prevention. Everything we've talked about is really trying to prepare to do any type of work in the heat. And then we're going to focus on now, what do we do if something happens, which is certainly inevitable, especially in the summertime. But there are a few things that we can do and look out for. If you are in any way in charge of youth sports or college sports, even any type of event where you're responsible, maybe for a group of people who are going to be exercising at a camp or doing anything outside when it's warm out or they're exposed to any heat stress, you have an emergency action plan and also procedures in place. I think Dr. Costa will tell you, out of all of the cases that maybe he sat on being an expert witness, when something bad happens, people either don't have a plan or no one knows what it is, where it was, or how to follow it. This is the first thing that we do with a company is we go in and make sure that they have a good plan, which is written down and it's very simple and it's also rehearsed, and every single person knows how to operate through this protocol if someone goes down or if there is, an expected case of even just heat exhaustion or things along those lines. So this is a really big area that we help with, but it's probably one of the most important decision making really practices that you can be involved with and help push for and advocate for really at any organizational thing you're involved in. Okay, finishing up quick with some of these signs and symptoms of some of our common heat-related illnesses. So I'm not going to talk about all of these in depth, but I do have some good resources to share. Our website, ksi.uconn.edu, and we've also created some great PDFs with the Health Action Alliance, which I'm going to share some snippets from here as well. So the first one, and probably one of the most common, is going to be heat syncope. So this is just a fainting episode where we're probably at a normal body temperature, but maybe we're a little dehydrated and we're just maybe not used to being in this stress of exercising in the heat before. So obviously someone being dizzy, feeling weak, having that tunnel vision, and then also, displaying a decrease or weak pulse, having pale or certainly sweaty skin, especially when we're outside, can be a sign. And then also briefer loss of consciousness as well. The treatment is very simple, just trying to move someone to the shade, having them sit, lie down, monitoring their vitals, and if someone obviously progresses worse, seeking additional medical help. Elevating their legs also is going to be really helpful to returning that blood to the heart and promoting rehydration too, if you have any fluid accessible for them. Last two I'll talk about are heat exhaustion and exertional heat stroke. So I'm actually going to pull these up side by side just to kind of compare some differences. They are both things that should be taken very seriously. And truthfully, you might not know or be able to distinguish between the two unless maybe you're an athletic trainer or a medical provider on this call. The clinicians will tell you that from their perspective, their diagnostic criteria between exertional heat stroke and heat exhaustion is going to be core temperature. So someone with a core temperature above about 105 or greater with central nervous system dysfunction. That's a tongue twister for me. That is going to be your two diagnostic criteria for exertional heat stroke. If there's a medical professional on site, they are using rectal thermometry, which is going to be the gold standard assessment method for that diagnosis, and they're putting someone in a cold tub immediately, as you can see here. Something that a lady from OSHA told me last week, which just absolutely blew my mind, is a lot of the cases that they get that come through where it's an OSHA citation is that workers will say that, oh, I thought he was drunk, or oh, I thought they were just high. And they didn't really recognize that someone was, exhibiting central nervous system dysfunction. They just perceived that because they looked so out of it, they were either drunk or high. So that is how it can present. Someone is just going to be abnormal. Maybe they frequently pass out. Maybe they get back up. Maybe they pass out again. But it is certainly a medical emergency that should be taken very seriously. There's a variety of signs and symptoms listed out here, and this resource is publicly available, I believe through our website, but also the Health Action Alliance, where we just helped them to create these resources. So happy to share the links to those as well. But calling 911 immediately, staying with them, and trying to cool them off with whatever you have available. And again, if you're in charge of a camp or something, in charge of people, you have to have cool whole body cold water immersion available and accessible because that's going to be the quickest way you can cool someone down. It's also going to be the most important thing to cool them down within 30 minutes of either collapse or that temperature assessment where it's determined that they have exertional heat stroke. Something that we've also been looking into is if we don't have that cold tub available, can we use body bags? So when EMS arrives, they certainly have these in their rigs. We did a study at the Falmouth Road Race where we looked at this, and it is pretty effective. So if we don't have anything else, can we use tarps? It's called the taco method, where you're just oscillating water back and forth. Again, trying to cover as much body surface area of the person as possible. And then, of course, letting medical professionals take over. Another policy that our Tufts team works really hard to try and implement is cool first, transport second. So that would mean EMS arrives on site, they cool them first before they transport them because that temperature window is critical, especially if we're in a remote setting. And sometimes that maybe we get to the hospital and maybe a temperature reading isn't conducted until maybe an hour later. And then at that point, things can go south very quickly. Last two things that I'll mention here, a really interesting study that our team did at the Falmouth Road Race a while ago was looking at the difference between an oral or ear thermometer and rectal thermometry, which I mentioned is the gold standard. And what they did was use these two devices on individuals who were having exertional heat strokes and actually actively being treated for them, as well as people who are not. And if we look at just using the ear thermometer that we're all familiar with from COVID, that thermometer only was able to classify three people who were having heat stroke. If you look here on this graph, it missed a substantial amount of people who were actually having exertional heat stroke. All that to say is any type of thermometer that's just going to get a scan of your head, your mouth, or your ear, or your armpit, those are not valid when we are hot. They're okay when we're thermal neutral, but they certainly cannot be used to assess temperature when we are exercising in the heat. So there's a lot of data on this. Happy to share this paper, but we have about a 4-degree Fahrenheit difference between the gold standard and the ear device, which is incredibly important for clinicians. Last thing that I think I did briefly mention this, but the timing matters so much. If you do not feel good, if you think someone else is looking a little wobbly, stopping what we're doing immediately, getting help, getting them into the shade if we can, water, and starting to cool someone off does save lives. So our time frame is about 30 minutes, our highest chance of survival. And people collapse, they have heat stroke. They can be very high temperatures, but if they are cooled aggressively quickly, they are completely fine. We treat heat strokes every year at the Falmouth Road Race, and people just walk away after being treated. They're completely fine because they're cooled so aggressively, so quickly. All of those news clips and snippets that I pulled earlier are likely because cooling was not initiated within that 30-minute window. And we do know there are long-term permanent complications and then most severely death when time continues being that hot. So lastly, just some key points and things that hopefully were interesting little tips of information today. Things that are within your power are understanding your risk factors. Another one that maybe I didn't mention, but if you are sick or if you've been ill, you're at a little bit higher of a risk for having that temperature increase a little bit faster. So being aware of things like that, or maybe we didn't sleep so well tonight, or maybe we're already dehydrated, what things are going to put us at a little bit higher risk for being more intolerant to heat stress that day. Our fitness status really matters. It's just like exercise. The better we are at it, the more we can tolerate it. So very same principles apply here too, but fitness status is very closely linked to our body's ability to thermoregulate. Your best friends are water, rest, and shade, and it's always better to take that break, especially if you're starting to feel a little lightheaded or maybe getting a little dizzy, things along those lines. Seek rest immediately and also use the buddy system. Food is fuel, so making sure we hydrate and fuel properly before, during, and after anything that we are doing in the heat. And worst case scenario, when something happens, the best thing you can do is aggressively cool someone. And of course, seeking medical help. And you're not going to be doing rectal thermometry on your own unless you're an athletic trainer or nurse or certified health professional. But something you can do is cool someone down or cool yourself down quickly. That's all I have for you today. My email is here if you have any questions. Our website is here. And again, I just want to shout out Dr. Abby Smith Ryan, who really taught me so much about sports nutrition and fueling. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to stay on and answer some questions for a bit.